Welcome, Raman. Thank you for joining me in this discussion.
Happy to do so.
Yeah. So we thought that we would discuss how to relate to our other inside, as we just described, the other being the unconscious, how to be aware of when unconscious contents are taking place, and how to work with those using the principles from the first 6 chapters, especially the editor.
Right.
And see how the content of the personal unconscious develops. That's an important aspect.
Right. So I would like to begin at the persona and shadow, anima and animus, just going over the basic structures that exist in the psyche according to Carl Jung.
Right.
Could you go into that, Dr. B?
Yeah. So how does the content end up in the unconscious? Well, as we're growing up, the parents or any caretakers educating us in terms of our behavior and what's behavior that's acceptable and what's not acceptable behavior, what's going to help us to fit in to the family and to friendships and society in general. And so a lot of our behavior is shaped from the very beginning to be positive. And for that to happen, other behaviors, like the natural instinctual drives that say me first, need to be identified and suppressed, pushed down, pushed back and away. And if we look at Carl Jung's structure and dynamics of the psyche, what's happening is that the parents are helping the child to develop what we call the persona. Persona, or the way that we relate to others in the world. And the persona needs to be positive, pleasant, accepting, agreeable in order for us to get along. So in order to have that persona develop, we need to have some of those more self-centered aspects of ourselves, which are natural. And of course, the infant has these drives and needs to survive and so on.
Yeah.
But they need to be held back or held down or suppressed. And that's what Jung calls the shadow. The shadow side would be that part of us that we don't either recognize ourselves or we don't want others to see. So the persona is the outward pleasing presentation, and the shadow is the inner kind of hidden dark side that we want to keep under control or out of sight.
So the unconscious patterns could be the shadow.
Yeah, that exists in
That exist in
the
in
dark
shadow.
side of the shadow. Now, shadow also has a lighter side that most people don't think about. You often hear people saying, you need to do your shadow work.
Right.
Well,
And what do we mean by that?
Yeah, well,
people
by
are
that
saying
we mean to take a look at where we're limited or maybe being disagreeable and take ownership for what's going on inside of ourselves rather than blaming others or creating conflict. The positive shadow would be something like this. Let's say someone is born into a business family and they have this artistic or mystical tendency. What will happen is that positive expression, the artistic side or the mystical side, will get pushed down. So that becomes what we call the positive shadow. That part of us that never gets the light of day and doesn't get a chance to get developed.
And how do defense mechanisms play in this? Because you're saying when we're pushing something down, then a defense mechanism occurs, correct?
Yeah. Well, 2 of the primary defense mechanisms here would be repression.
Repression,
Which is an out of consciousness, automatic shifting a drive or an interest into the unconscious because it's too threatening to have expressed.
And also suppression?
Suppression is different. There's more of a conscious awareness where we're choosing to push something back or push it away and push it down.
All right, Dr. B, I had a question for you. So what about the anima and the animus?
Okay, anima and animus. So those are terms, those are Latin words that point to what we call the soul. So the anima would be the female soul, the animus would be the masculine or male soul. And so we have our consciousness, like we would say that, you have the feminine consciousness, I have the masculine consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
But that's a little narrow and limiting. But we can say, oh, you're a female,
Mm-hmm.
and then I'm a male, and that
Mhm.
would be more objective. What I'm pointing to is this, that there are feminine traits like nurturance and birthing and caring and so on, and then there are masculine traits which have to do more with the intellect or logic, reasoning, and mechanical things and making things happen. Now, these are broad generalizations.
Mm-hmm.
The point I want to make here is that there are the feminine and the masculine traits that both males and females can carry.
Right, so it transcends gender.
It transcends gender, right. So that in the traditional Jungian sense, the masculine part of you would be called the animus.
Mm-hmm.
The feminine part of me would be called the anima.
Mm.
Okay? So originally it was thought anima would have to do with feelings,
Mm.
animus would have to do with thoughts,
Mm-hmm.
thinking. Now that's a rather rigid split, but that's how it was originally developed. But now we know that you have, of course, logic, and I have feelings.
I would like to think so.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that we carry both masculine and feminine traits.
Mm.
Although there's a tendency for the female to have more of the feminine in their consciousness and the masculine in the unconscious, and vice versa.
Yeah, what you've shared kind of gives a holistic view of the self,
Yeah.
right? That we have both characteristics, and that makes the whole self.
Right.
Would you say that's accurate?
Yeah, that's accurate, but let's understand what self means here in Jungian
Yes.
terms.
Yes.
So, self, in the Jungian terms, there's a small s self and a capital S self. Capital S self would be like the God image.
Mm-hmm.
Small s self would be the three parts of our psyche that we just talked about, the conscious, the personal unconscious, and the collective unconscious. What makes self important here in terms of all feelings are good and right, a guide to intelligent living,
Mm-hmm.
is that the self as an archetype represents psychological balance, wholeness, and completeness. Again, I want to say that self as an archetype represents wholeness, balance, and completeness.
Psychological wholeness.
Psychological, yes.
Yeah.
And so that's the ideal. Now, when we make mistakes, when defense mechanisms come in, when unconsciousness trips us up, like that iceberg flows upside down,
Mm-hmm.
that's because the self is saying it wants this human being to be whole or complete.
Mm.
And as Jung said, there's no such thing as perfection, but there is completion. And completion means finding a
Beautiful.
balance between the light and the dark, the developed and the not developed. And as he also said, it's finding a balance between joy and sorrow.
Right. That's beautiful what you've just shared. Did you want to complete your
No,
sentence?
please.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd
'Cause-
like to hear your thoughts. And
Yeah.
response.
What I hear you saying is that when conflict arises, when sorrow arises, suffering arises, it's a chance to go into deeper completion
Yes.
or a deeper understanding of yourself.
Right.
Like it gives you the yin and the yang, the masculine and the feminine. It balances one out
Right.
to understand conflict.
Yes, to understand conflict and then to work through the conflict.
Right.
To find the
so-
resolution. As we were saying,
Mhm.
all stories end
Right.
with a resolution to the conflict.
Could you go into that? How can one find those defense mechanisms and then find the solutions and the resolutions?
Okay.
Or an example of that?
Well, we can start with this animus concept, and then, people tend to pair up. Why? Because everything in the material universe is based on a balance of opposites.
Absolutely.
Everything is positive and negative charges, right? In the atoms and the electricity and night and day, everything is this balance of opposites.
Right.
And if we're going to find completion as a human being, Jung termed that the process of individuation.
Beautiful.
Individuation not meaning being an individual, but being not divided. In means not, and then individuation, divided, not divided. My consciousness not divided from my unconsciousness. In other words, to have a dialogue between the inner stories and my consciousness up here.
Beautiful. It's
So-
almost like developing that relationship is going to bring about a shift.
Right.
of some sort. We don't know what the unconscious may reveal, but that's the process of finding
Yeah,
out
it's a process.
what is it going to reveal, and how are
Right.
you going to work through it. And
Yes.
developing that relationship sounds like brings you in right relationship with yourself and others and your environment, right? By doing that work. So
Right, by doing the work.
you're not acting out or operating from a space of just the unconscious patterns entirely, or negative unconscious patterns.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
So then we aren't icebergs that are always upside down, floating in the ocean.
Right.
Right. So,
Yeah.
like for example, we pair up.
Mm-hmm.
Human beings pair up in this society. Usually, that's the norm or the common.
Mm-hmm.
Why? Okay, so you're female, I'm male.
Mm-hmm.
Your unconscious is masculine.
Mm-hmm.
My unconscious is feminine.
Mm-hmm.
So now we have this what's called a quaternio, or a relationship of the four of us.
Mm.
Okay, so it's our conscious relationship between you and I here, and it's our unconscious relationship down here.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so what happens, and here's where projection comes in. I project onto you the images I hold of the female, which is in my anima, soul aspect,
Mm-hmm.
and then I want to connect with you, I want to relate to you, I want to get to know you. And that'll happen if you also project your masculine aspects of the animas onto me. And I can carry that as a good movie screen. So that's why in the beginning of relationships we have this usually 6-month romantic period where everything is fine and wonderful.
And then the unconscious comes up.
And then over time, then the shadow part pops in, right? So I'm not sure if this is making sense. I might be going too fast.
No, it does make a lot of sense, is that eventually over time, your shadows will come up. And how do you integrate them? And mine may look different than yours,
Right.
but eventually they come up to be seen, to bring
Yeah.
about more, like the word that you used was wholeness and
Yeah,
completion.
ultimately it's to bring about wholeness.
Yeah.
But why would we want to think about that?
Right.
Well, we wouldn't, because in our society we're mainly based on pursuing pleasure and avoiding pain.
Right, yeah.
Right, as we discussed in chapter 5.
Mm-hmm.
So, but what happens is the relationship between, and we'll just use male and female here, there can be, the same gender relationships with the same projections going on.
Right, yeah. Again, it's not limited to gender.
No,
Right.
it's not gender specific.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. So ultimately, the relationship is there to expand our consciousness of who we are and what life is about. Okay? But if we don't understand that, we're going to end up in battles and have
Yeah.
arguments, right? When we no longer want to compromise to please the other. In the beginning, we want to form a relationship, so we will suppress. Here's what the defense mechanism is: we'll suppress certain needs or wants in order to develop the relationship. But then over time, we get so familiar with it, we start to say, well, no, wait a minute, what about my needs and wants here? And I start to bring them in. And then that's when we have to work at finding balance.
Balance
Yeah.
between the two. Beautiful. Can you go into a little bit of defense mechanisms and how they come up in service?
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, the foundational defense mechanism is repression, and that's automatic. That's when some experience happens that becomes very threatening to our self-image and our sense of security. So maybe I have an instinctual drive to possess and own everything. And if I really live that out, I'm not going to have good relationships with other people. So what happens is a part of me recognizes that and just kind of pushes it down so that I'm not aware of it anymore.
Okay. So these are mechanisms that we push down, and then they come up through relating to others.
Yes.
In our day-to-day lives.
Yes, the defense mechanisms are
Yeah.
part of the creation of the personal unconscious.
Right. And so this can happen in childhood, where we gather all this information and experiences that lead us to either suppress and neglect parts of ourselves.
Yeah, that's when
Yeah.
the most of that happens as part of our development, because as organisms, we're going to be thinking of our own survival and ourselves. So we have all of these drives and instincts which are taking place,
Right.
but might create disharmony between ourselves and others.
Right.
So that's when we learn, that's when it either gets
suppress.
repressed or suppressed.
Because we want to belong. It's
Yeah.
natural as human beings to want to belong.
Right.
But when it's maladaptive and doesn't serve us, we need to, it sounds like, do some inner work to see where's that balance. What are we suppressing? Is it something good?
It's important to note,
Yeah.
to be conscious of it.
Yeah.
There's a new term that came to me as we were talking about this earlier, which is reveal mechanisms.
Right.
Because
yeah.
defense mechanisms are there to protect our image of ourselves so we can relate to others more comfortably.
Mm-hmm.
Reveal mechanisms takes the content that was put in there by the defense mechanism and expresses it through what we call signs and symptoms.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, one of the most powerful and frequently encountered reveal mechanisms is projection.
Mm-hmm.
So what is projection? Projection happens when I have some kind of a inner story or belief or attitude that I no longer contain inside, but I project it out onto someone else or some other group.
Mm-hmm.
Just like in the movie theater, we have a projector that puts an image onto the blank screen.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's what's happening. If all gossip is based on projection.
Mm-hmm.
If I'm talking about somebody else's limitations or failings or faults, and I'm doing so with a strong emotion or affect, I'm projecting.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
In other words, I'm saying that person's really stingy.
So there's something else happening underneath
Yeah,
what I'm saying.
what's happening is I have that stinginess inside of me
Mm-hmm.
that I'm not dealing with.
So you're projecting it onto the other person because
Yeah.
it's easier to do so than address your own inner conflict.
Yeah, I can give a funny little personal example of this.
Yes, please.
This goes back years when I was living and working in Chicago, and I'm walking down the street at lunchtime, and I'm going out to get lunch. And I'm walking behind this very obese woman. She's about 300 pounds or so, wearing very tiny short shorts.
Mm-hmm.
And it's where you could see kind of the ripples in the legs
Mm-hmm.
and so on, the ripples of fat in the legs. And in my head comes this sentence: she shouldn't be wearing those shorts,
Mm-hmm.
just with that kind of an
Mhm.
inflection. And I thought, where is that coming from? And then I realized, oh, that's my mother. My mother would say something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Now, so what does that reveal? This is a reveal thing now. So
Yeah.
what that's revealing is that my mother had an issue around appearance and beauty.
Mm-hmm.
And she was a beautician, so she was
Mhm.
very sensitive to image and beauty. And she would tend to project that out onto other people.
Wow. Mm-hmm. And so then that information gets stored within you,
Yeah,
and over time that becomes not even your judgment, but it's just something that was in your unconscious, stored in
Yes,
your
yes.
unconscious.
so that goes back to the chapter 1 concept there of these thoughts being automatic.
Mm-hmm.
Most of our thinking is automatic. It's programmed from
Mhm.
earlier times. And so the work we need to do is to become more of the consciousness that is aware of these automatic thoughts, stories taking place,
Mm-hmm.
so that we don't become prisoners of time, chapter 4.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So then we can start to see, oh yeah, that happened.
A
Is
long
that
time
how
ago.
a long time ago. And is that how I want my life to be unfolding
Right.
forward?
Right.
Right?
Because if it's occurring in the present moment, you're going to take it into your future. So it's good to
Yeah.
address it in the present. And that's another thing, is that these deeply unconscious patterns we picked up years ago are impacting us,
Mhm. Yeah.
you know, at a deeply unconscious level. And people, you know, the viewers watching, sometimes these patterns of ours can start making decisions, you know, we can start making decisions from that space.
Yeah.
And those can impact our connections and what we do in life. So it's
Right.
very important to look
sure.
at these unconscious patterns,
Right.
and not ignore the signal on the dashboard, you know, of the feelings and the symptoms.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that what you just said reminds me of another defense mechanism called rationalization.
Right. Yeah.
Rationalization happens when something has an emotional basis for our taking an action or for some kind of expression, but we explain it through logic and reasoning. So one example would be this. Let's say there's a high school student that applies to 6 different colleges,
Mhm.
and one of them is their main selection. They
Mhm.
really would like to go there. And then they get rejected by that college, and so somebody comes up to them and says,
Mm-hmm.
"Oh, you must be really disappointed not being
Right,
able to go
yeah.
there." And the person says, "Oh no, it's really a good thing because that's too far, and it would be too hard to travel back and forth between my family, home, and there. So no, that's fine. I'm happy going so on." But really, inside, they are disappointed. It's just that they feel uncomfortable sharing that. So they give this kind of rational, logical reason why it's an okay thing that they didn't get in there.
Yeah, they're uncomfortable expressing the vulnerability,
Right.
right? Wow, thank you so much, Dr. B. That's so helpful. So, what are some other defense mechanism examples you can provide our viewers?
Okay, I mentioned in part one here about watching television and the politicians on the news.
Mm-hmm.
You see denial happening. Now, denial means that I am completely disavowing or saying something doesn't exist or doesn't have a place when it does. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
it's behind all substance abuse, all addiction.
Right.
Denial.
Yeah.
Oh, one more drink won't hurt.
One more cookie won't hurt.
Or
right?
one more cookie won't hurt.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, that reminds me of a woman I was working with that was concerned about her weight, and cookies were her favorite comfort food. And I just remember her telling me, she said, "Well, you know, I just broke my diet yesterday. I had one cookie." After that, I thought, well, since I broke it, I might as well go ahead and finish the bag.
Oh.
So, okay,
And rationalization.
that's rationalizing right there.
Yeah.
And denial at the same time.
Right.
Denial. Yeah, but you asked a question. I gave a side example, and I wanted to give a different example, but it's in my unconscious right now. It's not
Right.
in my consciousness.
I think you wanted to go into denial.
I was talking about
yes.
the politicians.
Politicians
Yeah, so
and
denial.
Yes.
They're denying that they have the same motivations that the other politicians do for making decisions and for
Right.
reasons for being on the news and so on.
Mm-hmm.
So they're denying that they also have these so-called negative traits that the other party has. And then they're splitting.
Okay.
Splitting is a black and white, all good, all bad defense mechanism.
And
So-
why do we use splitting?
For safety reasons,
Mm-hmm.
for survival and safety reasons. It's my tribe versus your tribe because I rely on my tribe for survival.
Mm-hmm.
And then that gets carried into everyday living now. I mean, in the past that was literal. You survive or you don't survive physically. But now it's the survival of the self-image and the comforts that we're attached to. And so the splitting is behind, in a benign level, it's behind our sports addiction, right? And these teams.
Yeah.
It's my team versus your team. We're the good guys, you're not the good guys, right? Or, God help us, as if somehow God's going to pick us versus them. See, that's a simple little light example of splitting. But splitting becomes serious, especially like in the political arena, where the Democrats or the Republicans, they're all good or they're all bad. And then that blocks dialogue. That
Right.
blocks being able to
Authentic, yeah.
discuss and negotiate things. So splitting can be very damaging.
Yeah.
That can also be just something that produces lightness and fun, like in sports.
Right, exactly. Thank you for sharing that. And how about displacement?
Displacement. I guess this is an example that probably everybody's heard at some point. A person's having trouble at work and they're getting all frustrated and angry. They've had a really bad day. And they come home and they kick the dog and they start screaming at the wife. Well, that would be displaced aggression, right? It belongs in the workplace and it needs to be resolved in the workplace, but yet it's brought into the home.
Okay. So, Dr. B, we were just talking about splitting in politics and in, even when we're enjoying our favorite sports team. Could you go deeper into that?
Well, these are examples that are pretty much societal. In other words, they're things that we all experience together in our society, this kind of splitting. Sometimes that happens in individuals, though, where it becomes more pathological. Now, I want to explain the term pathological a little bit. Pathos in Greek means to suffer. So pathology means that a person is suffering, one is suffering. So pathology doesn't mean like, oh, they're sick, they're bad, they're inferior. No, it means, oh, that's someone who's suffering.
Trauma.
And so
Right.
trauma creates
Yeah.
suffering. So we want to be sensitive to that. And I know we had been discussing before this different examples, and we were looking at regression as one of the defense mechanisms. And I think you
Right.
had a wonderful example
Yeah.
there of somebody that you were working with.
Right. So there's a client I was working with a few years back who wasn't nourishing herself, wasn't really eating properly at all,
Yeah.
wasn't taking showers, wasn't able
Mhm.
really to support herself. She was 18 years old.
Yeah.
And having a lot of issues when it comes to just living and being in life. So
Just the everyday
just
interaction
everyday
with
interactions
with others. Yeah.
with others. So when we did a deeper dive, and brought the bottom of the iceberg up, right? She realized that she was regressing. We realized she was regressing, and regression is another defense mechanism.
So could you say more about regression, what it is, and
Yeah.
how this
Right.
person was living that?
Right. So regression can pop up when, let's say we have a trauma, even at a specific point in life, right? We can go back into that trauma as adults because maybe our age kind of stopped at that point, or we had, we weren't able to grow from that space.
So it's regressing back to that point.
She was regressing back to a point at 12 years old when she wasn't able to take care of herself, wasn't able to get out of bed due to a deep trauma that happened in her life. So she was triggered back into that space as an adult, and she wasn't able to care for herself. So once that was brought to the conscious, we were able to work with it, and she realized that she really does want to take care of herself. And even though the body, the unconscious, was screaming for more attention, for others to care for her, that's not how she wanted to operate in life. She wants to get support where she can, but otherwise she's wanting to take care of herself. So we were able to do some deep work on that and bring her back to being 18, and heal some parts of that younger self, the inner child.
Right, so that was waiting to be healed. And it was through the understanding and acknowledgement that that could take place.
Exactly.
I think you just gave a great example of defense mechanism and reveal mechanisms.
Right, yeah.
The defense mechanism had sequestered this event at 12 years old into the unconscious. It was revealing itself through the different signs and symptoms of in her behavior, where she was no longer taking care of herself. In fact, going back to 12 and even going back into infancy, when she had to be bathed or clothed or taken care of totally. So that's a regression that would be in service of the ego development, or developing her strength moving forward.
Exactly. So those symptoms and the signal on the dashboard of the feelings were very important, right? So there are no bad feelings, like you say. There are no wrong bad feelings, right? Or just not bad feelings. There can be some wrong feelings.
Well, no, I don't think there's any wrong feelings.
No.
No. What you might be referencing would be difficult or distressing emotional
expressions, exactly.
Yeah, that's where the quote wrong can come in. Never.
For feelings.
All feelings are good and right.
Exactly, and I'm glad we made that distinction, because it's very important that how we emote something, that has consequences. But our feelings, they're all there to serve us in some ways, to expand consciousness, and to get us in right relationship with ourselves and others, and to bring about harmony too.
Yeah. So that's where the idea of the reveal mechanisms comes in. That it's always positive. It's wanting us to see something with greater clarity, so that in this instance of this girl, there can be a healing taking place through the acknowledgement and through
even self-nurturance.
And self-nurturing, yes.
Yeah. I mean, she was able to, and I think we spoke about this in the past too, how self-soothing mechanisms can be used. Right? So she, over time, learned adaptive rather than maladaptive self-soothing techniques, right? Rather than pacifying with her phone. Why not we nourish with a good meal and put a good meal in our body and not forget the body, right? Because sometimes that's what happens with trauma and other instances. Yeah,
the body gets left out.
The body gets left out. And the body is, I think, hurt the most when we don't honor these feelings, right? It can be deeply neglected in
Yes,
in
and
many
that's when
ways.
suffering happens, and the suffering, again, is the invitation to become more conscious.
Dr. B, I wanted to ask you, so we had a beautiful discussion here as we wrap up for today. How does this serve humanity, this work, when we do the inner work?
How does it serve humanity? Very interesting. This reminds me of what Carl Jung said in a 1959 interview with Lawrence Vanderpost, the BBC. And Vanderpost said to Carl Jung, he said, we live in a very unstable time now with this atomic bomb and the conflict between nations. He said, Dr. Jung, do you think that humanity is going to destroy itself through the atomic bomb, or will we somehow manage to escape that fate? And he paused for a second, and he said, well, that depends on how many individuals in our societies are able to find a balance between the tension of the opposites within themselves.
Right.
Because the more people there are that have that internal balance, the more it can go down into the ocean or the collective unconscious and have an impact at that level. It sounds kind of strange or mystical. You know, it's kind of like that, what is it, the 100th monkey example, Kevin Keyes. I don't know if you're familiar with the example. People can look it up, the 100th monkey. It's where two islands existing in the ocean 50 miles apart, and one monkey on one island learns how to rinse the fruit off in the ocean and get the sand out and so on. And then others learned from that monkey, and then they learned from that monkey. And then finally, when the 100th monkey learned it on one island, Island A, all of a sudden the monkey on Island B started to do that. Or many of the monkeys on B started to do that. It's like there was a transmission of that knowledge.
Like a ripple effect.
And there is something in our physics that tells us this. It's called spooky action at a distance, or quantum entanglement, where if two particles are in a relationship like this, together rotating in the same direction, and then one goes to the other end of the universe and reverses, this one will reverse immediately. So this isn't just mystical stuff, this is science these days.
Right.
Yeah, so it's so important that each one of us as individuals create and find that internal balance and that sense of wholeness.
Right. It's almost like you're saying the way we can heal the world is when we heal ourselves.
Heal ourselves. That's where it has to start.
It starts from within.
If it's not here, it won't be out there.
Right. And that's beautiful to hear from a clinical psychologist like yourself, who has done beautiful work in his life, to come back to that notion of when you heal yourself, you heal the world, and you bring about greater harmony and beauty. And any other last parting points that you'd like to make before we end today?
What I'd like to say at this point, and unless you have something more, I wanted to mention a few books.
Yes, please.
And for those of you who are interested in understanding more about Carl Jung's structure and dynamics of the psyche, I have two books to recommend. One is called Jungian Psychoanalysis, and that's by Windborn. And the other one is called Jung, A Complete Introduction by Phil Goss, G-O-S-S. So that's for understanding the structure and dynamics of the mind, the psyche. For working with the content, I would highly suggest the book Focusing, like focusing your camera. Focusing by Eugene Gendlin, G-E-N-D-L-I-N. And if you are really interested in it, go to focusing.org, and you can look up training in the focusing process. And lastly, I would recommend Byron Katie's book, Loving What Is. I think it's a very simple way to reveal projection taking place, and it's also a lot of fun. And so, that's Loving What Is, Byron Katie. And you can get into her website, which is thework.org.
And Sunyata, did we mention Sunyata?
Oh, Sunyata. Oh, I love Sunyata.
Yes.
Where did Sunyata go? For those of you that have a kind of mystical and whimsical outlook on life, I recommend Sunyata, The Life and Sayings of a Rare-Born Mystic. I knew Sunyata, and he was really quite a special individual. Half of the book is about his favorite sayings, and I'm going to read one of them to you that has to do with projection. It's on page 112. Which is hard to find without glasses. What Paul says about Peter tells us more about Paul than it does Peter. All of our malicious accusations of others are really our own ego projections. That which focuses on these supposed blemishes in others is really existing within ourselves. But don't despair. The sun also has its spots, and these are part of its wholeness and its radiance.
Thank you so much
Thank you.
for sharing your wisdom, Dr. B. And thank you so much for listening.